Michael Bennett was the kind of man people forgot the moment he walked out of a room, and he preferred it that way. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the quiet economy of someone who had learned long ago that attention was a currency he no longer wished to spend. Inside the tight circle of aviation engineers who actually understood what kept a modern aircraft in the sky, his name meant something. Outside that circle, he was simply a man in a worn gray jacket, carrying a backpack with a broken zipper, holding the hand of an 8-year-old girl named Emma. He lived in a small house 2 towns over from the airfield where he had once worked, the kind of house with a leaning fence and a kitchen table that wobbled unless you folded a napkin under one leg. His wife had died 6 years earlier, taken slowly by an illness that drained the color out of every room in the house before it finally took her. Michael did not talk about that year much. He had simply woken up one morning and understood that there was a small girl asleep down the hall who needed a father more than the world needed another engineer chasing promotions, and he had rearranged his entire life around that single fact. He had been offered management positions twice in the years since. Both times he had turned them down without much hesitation, because both times the job would have meant more travel, more evenings away, more mornings when Emma would eat breakfast alone. He was not interested in being important. He was interested in being present, in being the man who showed up at the school science fair with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, the man who checked homework at the kitchen table and burned the pancakes on Saturday mornings, and never once made his daughter feel like she was anyone's obligation. Emma, for her part, was sharp in a way that made teachers pause and reconsider their lesson plans. She read 2 grades above her level. She asked questions that circled back and caught adults in their own contradictions, and she had just won first place in a regional science competition for a project on airflow and wing design, a subject she had absorbed simply by listening to her father talk. She was polite with strangers, fiercely loyal to the few friends she had, and utterly convinced that her father was the smartest man alive, though she had no idea just how right she was. The trip they were taking that week was a rare indulgence. Michael's mother was turning 70, and the whole scattered family was gathering at the old farmhouse 1,000 miles away. He had been saving airline points for nearly 3 years, the kind of quiet, patient accumulation that never showed up on anyone's radar, and he had finally cashed them in for 2 business-class seats. It was an extravagance he would never have chosen for himself, but Emma had never flown business class before, and the thought of her small face lighting up at the wider seat and the warm towel service was worth more to him than the miles themselves. Emma had barely slept the night before. Too excited to settle down, she packed her own backpack, insisting on bringing the folder with her science fair certificate, 3 chapter books, and a water bottle covered in stickers of airplanes. She had asked her father, at least a dozen times over the past week, whether business class really had wider seats, whether they would really bring her a warm towel before the plane even took off, whether she might be allowed to keep the little blanket. Michael answered every question patiently, never once telling her to quiet down, never once treating her excitement as anything less than precious. He had thought, more than once in the days leading up to the trip, about how quickly childhood moved past a person, how soon the folder full of certificates would be replaced by college applications, and then by a life entirely her own. He wanted her to remember this trip, not because of the seats or the towels, but because of the 2 of them together, laughing about nothing in particular 30,000 feet above the ground. When they boarded that morning, she gripped her father's hand and practically skipped down the jet bridge, whispering to him that this was going to be the best trip of her whole life. Michael watched her go and felt, for a brief moment, something close to peace. Elise Hayes boarded 12 minutes later, and the entire cabin seemed to shift around her arrival, the way a room shifts when a storm front moves in. She was 35 years old, the chief executive of an investment firm with her name stitched quietly into half the skyline of the city she had built her empire in, and she moved through the world with the practiced confidence of someone who had never once been told no and meant to keep it that way. She was undeniably striking, dressed in a tailored cream suit, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that seemed to announce her presence before she even spoke. Behind her came an assistant, clutching a tablet and 2 phones. And behind him, came two broad-shouldered men in dark suits whose only apparent job was to stand near Elise and look serious. The flight attendants greeted her by name before she had said a word, bowing slightly at the waist in a way that made several passengers glance up from their books. She thanked no one. She simply walked to her seat, handed her coat to the nearest attendant without looking at them, and settled in as though the entire aircraft existed for the sole purpose of delivering her safely to her next meeting. Her seat, as it happened, was directly beside Michael and Emma. The moment she noticed them, her expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes that she did not bother to hide. She looked at Michael's jacket, the kind you could buy at any department store for $40, and then at Emma's backpack with its fraying strap, and then at the stack of chapter books Emma had already spread across her tray table, and something like distaste crossed her face before she turned away and pulled out her own phone. Elise had built her career on the belief that comfort and respect were things a person earned through wealth, and wealth alone. She had grown up with very little, a fact she rarely mentioned, and had spent 2 decades trying to erase from every visible trace of her life. And somewhere in the long climb from nothing to everything, she had convinced herself that the discomfort she once felt as an outsider could only be cured by making certain no one ever again mistook her for someone unimportant. She surrounded herself with reminders of how far she had come, the tailored suits, the handbags, the assistants who anticipated her moods before she voiced them, and she had little patience left for anything that threatened to blur the line she had worked so hard to draw between herself and people, like the man now seated beside her. She muttered something to her assistant, low enough that she probably assumed no one else could hear, about how business class had really gone downhill in recent years. Michael heard it. He said nothing. He had spent enough years in rooms full of powerful, dismissive people to know that reacting rarely accomplished anything. And besides, Emma was chattering happily beside him about the little window shade and the buttons on her seat, and he was not about to let a stranger's rudeness dim that. Still, the other passengers within earshot exchanged glances, the quiet, universal recognition that they were sitting near someone who believed the rules of common decency applied to everyone except her. The plane had not yet pushed back from the gate when it happened. Emma reached for her water bottle, the one covered in airplane stickers, wanting to take a sip before takeoff the way she always did. A flight attendant, passing through the aisle, bumped a cart against a seat back. The plane gave a small, unexpected jolt as ground equipment shifted beneath it, and the bottle slipped from Emma's small hand. Water splashed across the narrow space between the seats, and a good portion of it landed squarely on the leather handbag resting at Elise's feet, a bag that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Elise shot up out of her seat as though she had been struck. Her voice cracked through the cabin, sharp and furious, demanding to know what on earth this child thought she was doing. Emma froze, her small hands trembling, her eyes filling instantly with tears. Michael moved fast, pulling every napkin within reach, pressing them gently against the bag, apologizing in a low, steady voice, offering without hesitation to pay for any damage, offering his own jacket to blot the leather dry. It did not matter. Elise snatched the bag away from him, as though his hands themselves were contaminated. Holding it up, and inspecting it with the theatrical horror of someone discovering a crime scene, she informed him, loudly enough for 3 rows in either direction to hear, that the bag was worth more than he likely made in an entire year. More, she added with a cruel little laugh, than his entire life was probably worth. Emma began to cry in earnest now, apologizing over and over in a small broken voice, and the sound of it seemed to embarrass no one but the people around them. The tension in the cabin thickened. A businessman 2 rows up lowered his newspaper and frowned. An elderly woman across the aisle pressed her lips into a tight line. A flight attendant hovered nearby, uncertain, clearly unwilling to challenge a passenger, whose company likely funneled considerable revenue toward the airline's corporate accounts. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved to intervene. It was the kind of silence that exists specifically to protect the comfort of the powerful, at the expense of everyone else. And Michael recognized it instantly, because he had lived inside that particular silence more than once in his life. He kept his voice calm. He told Elise again that he was sorry. that he would gladly pay for any cleaning or repair the bag required, that it had been an accident and nothing more. His calm seemed only to inflame her further. She turned to him with an expression of pure contempt and told him that people like him simply did not belong in a cabin like this, that some mistakes could not be fixed with an apology and a napkin, and that she intended to see something done about it. She reached for the call button before Michael could respond. And within moments, a flight attendant appeared at her side, followed shortly by another, and then by a member of the ground crew still standing near the open cabin door. Elise did not lower her voice. She informed them, in the clipped tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly, that she wanted these 2 passengers removed from her flight. She gestured toward Michael and Emma, as though they were a spill to be cleaned rather than human beings sitting 3 feet away from her. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing toward Michael, who held up his boarding pass, and explained quietly that they had valid tickets, that this had been an unfortunate accident, that his daughter was 8 years old and frightened, and had done nothing more than knock over a bottle of water. Elise cut across him without even glancing his way. She told the crew that she did not care about tickets, that she was a platinum member with the airline's board on speed dial, that if this was not resolved to her satisfaction, she would make certain the airline understood exactly how unhappy she was. The 2 men in dark suits, who had been standing quietly near the front of the cabin, stepped closer at some unspoken signal from Elise. Their presence alone seemed to answer the question of what she meant by resolved. The senior flight attendant attempted to mediate, explaining gently that removing a ticketed passenger over an accidental spill was highly unusual and would need to go through the captain, but Elise was already threatening to call the airline's executive board directly, already threatening lawsuits and canceled contracts and headlines that would make the airline regret ever letting this happen on her flight. Emma had gone very still, pressing herself against her father's side, her small face buried against his arm, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Michael wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close, and when the 2 security men stepped forward, he did not raise his voice, did not argue, did not so much as stand up in protest. He simply looked down at his daughter and told her, in the softest voice he could manage, that everything was going to be fine, that she had nothing to be sorry for, that sometimes people had bad days and it had nothing to do with her. The passengers nearby watched this unfold with a mixture of discomfort and helpless sympathy. A woman across the aisle reached over and gently squeezed Emma's shoulder, whispering that it was going to be okay, sweetheart. The businessman too rose up, muttered something under his breath about the injustice of it all, but did not rise from his seat. It was the particular tragedy of the moment that everyone could see how wrong it was, and no one, apparently, felt they had the standing to stop it. A young mother traveling with an infant leaned toward her husband and whispered that someone ought to say something, but her husband only shook his head slightly, glancing toward the 2 security men now standing at the edge of the row, and said quietly that it was not their fight to pick. It was a sentiment that seemed to hang over the entire cabin, an unspoken agreement that intervening on behalf of strangers carried risks none of them were prepared to take, not against someone with Elise's evident reach and resources. Michael understood that silence better than any of them. He had spent years watching rooms full of capable people stay quiet in the face of something wrong because speaking up cost more than staying seated, and he did not blame a single one of them for it now. Michael gathered their bags without complaint, took Emma's small hand in his, and prepared to walk off a flight he had saved 3 years of airline points to afford, all because his daughter had spilled a few ounces of water. He did not look at Elise as he stood. He did not ask the security men to reconsider, did not appeal to the flight attendants for mercy, did not do any of the things a person might do when they still believed fairness could be argued into existence. He simply lifted Emma's backpack onto his own shoulder, tucked her books beneath his arm, and prepared to accept an injustice, the way he had accepted so many quiet injustices before, without theater, without complaint, because raising his voice had never once, in his experience, made the powerful listen faster. It was at that exact moment, as the flight attendant reached for the intercom to request final confirmation from the flight deck, that the cockpit door opened. A man in a captain's uniform stepped into the cabin, his eyes immediately going to the small crowd gathered near row 4, his brow furrowing at the sight of 2 security men closing in on a crying child and her father. He asked, in a voice that carried easily down the aisle, what exactly was going on. Elise wasted no time answering him. She launched into her version of events with practiced fluency, describing a reckless child, a ruined designer handbag, an irresponsible father who had allowed the situation to spiral, and a level of disruption that she felt entitled compensation and immediate removal of the offending passengers. She spoke the way people speak when they are certain no one in the vicinity holds more authority than they do, certain that her wealth and her title would settle the matter before it even became a conversation. The captain listened, nodding slowly, his gaze drifting past her toward the man standing quietly beside the crying child, arms wrapped protectively around his daughter, saying nothing in his own defense. Something in the captain's expression shifted the moment he actually looked at Michael's face. He went still. He tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when a memory is surfacing faster than they can place it. And he took 2 steps closer, studying the man in front of him, with an intensity that had nothing to do with spilled water or ruined handbags. He said the name slowly, almost disbelieving, as though testing whether the syllables would confirm what his eyes were telling him. Michael Bennett. It was not a question so much as a recognition arriving in real time. And for a moment, the captain simply stood there, staring at a man he had clearly not expected to ever see again, let alone find standing in the aisle of his own aircraft being escorted off like a common troublemaker. Michael looked up, and something in his tired expression eased into the faintest, most tired kind of smile. He said it had been a long time. The captain did not respond right away. He seemed to be recalculating everything he had just heard from Elise Hayes, running it against some other memory entirely. And the change in his posture was immediate and unmistakable. He straightened. He turned toward the security men and told them, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, to step back. The cabin had gone quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone senses that the story they thought they understood has just cracked open into something else entirely. Elise, sensing the shift but not yet understanding it, opened her mouth to object, but the captain held up a hand, asking her to wait, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. He asked if Michael remembered him. Michael said of course he did, and something passed between the 2 men that no one else in the cabin could yet interpret, though everyone could feel its weight. It had happened 11 years earlier, on a cold morning at a regional testing facility 3 states away, back when Michael was still working as a structural inspection engineer for a manufacturer that built commercial aircraft. He had been assigned, almost by accident, to a routine pre-flight inspection of a new aircraft scheduled for its first test flight later that day. It was the kind of assignment nobody fought over, tedious and unglamorous, the sort of work that existed in the background of an industry obsessed with speed and headlines. Michael had walked the wing that morning with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, running his hands along the seams, checking measurements against specifications, refusing to rush, even as other engineers around him grew impatient to clear the aircraft for its scheduled departure. It was during that inspection that he found it. A hairline fracture along a critical structural joint near the wing root. So small that it had passed 2 previous inspections without notice, so small that most engineers would have logged it as cosmetic and moved on without a second thought. Michael did not move on. He flagged it immediately, and when his supervisor waved it off as insignificant, he refused to sign the clearance. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that the test flight was already behind schedule, that investors were waiting, that a delay would cost the company money it could not easily explain away. He was told that he was being overly cautious, that a fracture that size could not possibly compromise the integrity of the wing. He held his ground anyway, because he had learned, long before that morning, that being liked was never worth being wrong about something that could cost someone their life. His supervisor had grown increasingly agitated as the morning wore on, reminding Michael more than once that inspectors who caused unnecessary delays did not tend to last long in the industry, that there were a dozen other engineers who would happily sign off and let the schedule proceed as planned. Michael had listened to every warning calmly and had not moved an inch. He remembered thinking, as he stood beneath the wing with his flashlight tracing the hairline seam for the third time, that he would rather lose his job over being cautious than keep it by staying silent about something he could not unsee. It was not bravery in the way people like to imagine bravery, dramatic and loud. It was simply refusal, quiet and stubborn, the kind that rarely earned anyone a medal in the moment it happened. He escalated the issue past his supervisor, went over the man's head to the chief engineer, and insisted on a full structural analysis before the aircraft left the ground. The delay was expensive and unpopular, and for several hours, Michael was treated like a man who had single-handedly derailed a multi-million-dollar project over nothing. Then the analysis came back, and the room went silent in an entirely different way. The fracture, under the stress of takeoff and the pressure changes of altitude, would very likely have propagated catastrophically within the first 20 minutes of flight. The wing would have failed. There would have been no warning, no time to react, nothing but a routine test flight, ending in a way that no one in that hangar would ever have recovered from. The pilot scheduled to fly that aircraft that morning was a young captain still building his hours toward a commercial career. A man with a wife at home and a baby daughter, not yet a year old. A man who had no idea, as he sat in the crew lounge drinking coffee and reviewing his flight plan, how close he had come to never seeing either of them again. That man was standing in the aisle of this aircraft now, 11 years older, a captain's stripes on his shoulder, staring at the engineer who had once refused to let him die over a company's impatience with schedules. He turned to the cabin and did not wait to be asked. He told the passengers, in a voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide, that 11 years ago the man standing before them had found a structural fracture that everyone else had missed, had refused every pressure to look the other way, and had grounded a flight that the captain himself had been scheduled to fly that very morning. He told them, plainly and without embellishment, that if Michael Bennett had not done his job with more integrity than anyone around him that day, he would not be standing in this aisle right now. He would not have a wife. He would not have raised his own children. None of it would exist, because of a decision made in a cold hangar by a man nobody had bothered to thank. The cabin was utterly silent. Even the low hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background of that moment. The captain reached out and shook Michael's hand, holding it a beat longer than a simple handshake required, and said, quietly enough that only those nearby could hear, that he had never forgotten his name, that he had told the story to every young engineer he had ever mentored since, though he had never once expected to see the man himself again, let alone find him standing in his own cabin about to be dragged off over a splash of water. A flight attendant near the galley, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, pressed a hand to her mouth. She said, almost to herself, that she remembered that incident, that it had been used as a training case study during her certification years ago, cited as an example of why inspection protocols mattered even when they were inconvenient, even when they cost time and money and made people uncomfortable. She had never known the engineer's actual name until this very moment, and something about hearing it now, attached to the tired, ordinary-looking man standing in the aisle with his crying daughter, seemed to hit her harder than she expected. The passengers who had watched Michael's quiet dignity through the entire ordeal now looked at him with an entirely different kind of attention. The businessman who had muttered under his breath earlier now stood and began, quietly, to clap. Another passenger joined him, and then another, until the sound spread down the cabin in a slow, rolling wave, not raucous or performative, but heavy with genuine respect, the kind of applause reserved for people who had done something extraordinary without ever asking for recognition. Emma lifted her tear-streaked face from her father's side and looked around at the sound, confused at first. Then slowly beginning to understand that something had shifted, that the men who had been about to pull her father off the plane were now standing awkwardly out of the way, that the captain was shaking her father's hand like he was someone important. A small, uncertain smile broke through her tears. The first one since the water had spilled, and she looked up at Michael as though seeing him for the very first time in a new light. Elise Hayes stood frozen at her seat, her earlier fury draining visibly from her face as the meaning of the moment settled over her. She looked, for the first time since boarding, genuinely uncertain, glancing between the captain, the applauding passengers, and the quiet man she had just tried to have physically removed from a flight over a wet handbag. The confident mask she wore so easily had slipped, and underneath it was something closer to panic. Unbeknownst to her, one of the passengers, seated further back, had already lifted a phone during the confrontation, recording the entire exchange from the moment she demanded the two security men remove a crying 8-year-old and her father. The footage had captured everything: her raised voice, her cruel remark about Michael's worth, the security men closing in, and now the captain's stunned recognition and the applause that followed. Within minutes of the plane reaching cruising altitude, that footage was already spreading, uploaded and shared and forwarded across networks faster than any single person on that aircraft could have predicted. By the time the plane had been in the air for 2 hours, the video had found its way into the hands of business journalists who recognized Elise Hayes immediately. And by the time it had been in the air for 4, her company's public relations team was fielding calls they had no adequate way to answer. The firm's stock, already sensitive to headlines given a recent string of controversies involving executive conduct, began sliding in after-hours trading. Board members who had spent years quietly tolerating Elise's reputation for ruthlessness now found themselves staring at a video that made that ruthlessness impossible to ignore or explain away. None of this reached Elise mid-flight. Not immediately, cut off as she was from the outside world at 35,000 feet. But she could sense, in the way passengers now glanced at her and then quickly looked away, that something had changed beyond her control. She sat back down slowly, her phone clutched in her hand, though there was no signal to receive anything on it. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she looked genuinely small. Her assistant, seated just behind her, had noticed the shift too, though he said nothing, unsure whether comforting his employer or staying silent was the safer course. He had worked for Elise for nearly 3 years and had watched her dismiss waiters, doormen, junior associates, and once an entire catering staff without so much as a flicker of hesitation. And he had learned, as most people around her eventually learned, that pointing out her behavior in the moment rarely ended well for the person doing the pointing. He simply busied himself with his tablet, refreshing a screen with no signal, and waited to see what the ground would look like once they landed. When the aircraft eventually landed and phones came back to life around the cabin, the messages began arriving in a flood. Her assistant's face went pale as he scrolled through headlines already forming, business outlets running with the story of a CEO caught attempting to have a grieving single father and his young daughter forcibly removed from a flight, only for it to be revealed that the man in question had once saved the very captain now flying the plane. The board had already convened an emergency call. There was talk of suspension pending review, talk of a formal apology, talk of consequences that Elise, for all her power, could not simply threaten or buy her way out of. She turned to Michael as the passengers began gathering their belongings to disembark, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. She began, haltingly, to apologize, the words clearly unfamiliar in her mouth, clumsy in a way that suggested she had rarely if ever had to say them before. She said she hadn't known, as though not knowing excused the cruelty, and then seemed to hear herself and stopped. Michael looked at her for a long moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not remind her of what she had said about his life being worth less than a handbag. He simply told her, quietly, that he hoped she would remember today, not because of who he turned out to be, but because of how she had treated 2 strangers before she knew anything about them at all. He said that kindness should never depend on finding out someone is important first. Then he took Emma's hand and turned to gather their things, offering Elise neither forgiveness nor cruelty in return, only a kind of steady indifference that unsettled her far more than anger would have. The lack of retaliation in his response seemed to affect the surrounding passengers even more than the applause had earlier. Several of them exchanged glances, murmuring that the man could have humiliated her further, could have demanded an apology on camera, could have leaned into the moment the way so many people would have, and instead he had simply asked her to be better, and walked away. It was, several would later remark, the most striking part of the entire ordeal, more striking even than the story of the fracture in the wing. Before the aircraft doors opened, The captain approached Michael once more, this time with a request rather than an apology. He asked, with something like boyish eagerness breaking through his professional composure, whether Emma might like to see the cockpit before they disembarked, whether she would like to sit where the pilots sat and see the instruments that kept airplanes safely in the sky. Emma's eyes went wide, her earlier tears entirely forgotten, and she looked up at her father with an expression of pure, desperate hope. Michael laughed softly, the first real laugh he had allowed himself since the whole ordeal began, and told her to go ahead. The captain led her forward himself, walking her through the narrow cockpit door, pointing out the controls with the patient enthusiasm of a man showing off something he loved to someone who might actually understand it. Emma peppered him with questions about altitude and thrust and wing design, questions far more sophisticated than most 8-year-olds would think to ask, and the captain answered every one of them, visibly delighted. While she was occupied, the flight attendants and a handful of remaining passengers gathered informally around Michael, asking him, gently, what had actually happened that day, 11 years ago, curious now in a way that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with genuine respect. Michael answered simply, without embellishment, the way he answered most things. He said he had not done anything heroic. He had simply looked closely at something everyone else wanted to rush past, and he had refused to sign his name to a decision he did not believe in. He told them that he had never gone into engineering to be remembered, that the whole point of the work, as far as he understood it, was invisible by design. Nobody thanked the engineer who caught the fracture before it ever became a headline. Nobody wrote articles about the flights that never crashed because someone insisted on checking twice. The job, he said, was to make sure people got home safely to the families waiting for them. And if he had done that even once in his career, that was enough. He said it without a trace of false modesty, simply stating what he believed to be true, and the quiet certainty in his voice moved several people to silence. An older passenger near the front, a retired airline mechanic himself, nodded slowly as he listened, saying that he had spent 30 years in the industry and had seen exactly the opposite far too often. Engineers pressured into signing off on things they were not fully certain about because a delay looked bad on a quarterly report. He said the story Michael was describing so plainly was, in his experience, rarer than most people would ever want to admit, and that the industry owed more to men like him than it typically bothered to acknowledge. Michael accepted the comment with a small nod and did not argue the point, though he clearly had no interest in dwelling on it either. A teenager traveling alone in the row behind them, headphones now pulled down around his neck, asked shyly whether Michael had ever been scared that day, standing his ground against people with far more power than he had. Michael considered the question seriously before answering. He said that fear had certainly been there, quiet and persistent underneath everything else, but that it had never once felt like the deciding factor. What mattered more, he said, was imagining the alternative, imagining a phone call to a family somewhere, explaining that a plane had gone down because everyone in the room had been too afraid of an inconvenient delay to say the obvious thing out loud. Once he pictured that call, the fear became easy enough to set aside. The captain, returning from the cockpit with Emma still glowing with excitement, overheard the tail end of this and added his own voice to it, telling the remaining passengers that men like Michael were the reason commercial aviation had become as safe as it was. Not the executives whose names appeared on press releases, not the shareholders who demanded faster timelines, but the quiet, stubborn people in hangars and inspection bays who refused to let convenience override caution. He said it was a lesson he tried to pass on to every young pilot and engineer he trained, though he admitted, with a rueful smile, that he had never expected to be teaching it in front of the very man who had taught it to him first. Emma, listening to all of this, with the fierce attentiveness of a child absorbing something she instinctively understood mattered, slipped her hand back into her father's and told him, quietly, that she was proud of him. Michael knelt down to her level and told her that everything he did because of her, that watching her grow into someone curious and kind was worth more to him than any recognition a room full of strangers could offer. It was a private moment, but several nearby passengers heard it anyway, and there was not a dry eye among them. In the days that followed, The consequences for Elise Hayes unfolded exactly as the board's emergency call had foreshadowed. She was formally suspended, pending an internal investigation into her conduct. A suspension that within 2 weeks became permanent, as further details of her treatment of employees and service staff over the years came to light, encouraged now by people who finally felt safe coming forward. The firm issued a public statement, distancing itself from her behavior, and the board began the slow, undignified process of searching for new leadership, while reporters camped outside offices that had once operated with the quiet, untouchable confidence of old money. Elise disappeared from public view for a while after that. The kind of disappearance reserved for people who have spent a lifetime performing power and suddenly find themselves without an audience. What she did with that time was not something anyone outside her closest circle knew for certain, though word eventually trickled out that she had begun, in small and unpublicized ways, working with organizations that supported families of single parents, an effort several assumed was public relations and others, more generously, believed might be something closer to genuine reflection. Whatever it was quieter than anything she had ever done before, and quieter, perhaps, was the point. Some of her former colleagues speculated that the fall had been a long time coming, that the video had simply given the board the cover it needed to remove someone whose behavior had quietly worried them for years, but whose results had always made her difficult to challenge. Others were less generous, suggesting that without the cameras and the headlines, nothing about her would have changed at all. Nobody could say for certain which version was true, least of all Elise herself, who spent the better part of a year in a kind of enforced stillness she had never experienced in her adult life, stripped of the assistants and the security men and the reflexive deference she had come to treat as simply the natural order of things. What was certain was that the woman who eventually resurfaced, quietly, in a much smaller role at a nonprofit foundation 2 years later, bore little resemblance in her public conduct to the one who had once ordered a crying child removed from an airplane over a splash of water. Whether the change reached all the way down to who she truly was, no one could say with confidence, not even the people who worked alongside her now. But those who had known her before noticed, at the very least, that she said thank you to people now, and meant it. And that alone was more than most of them had ever expected to see. Michael's life changed far less dramatically, which was exactly how he wanted it. He returned home from his mother's 70th birthday with Emma, and within days the story had mostly faded from the news cycle the way stories do, replaced by newer headlines and fresher outrage. He continued driving Emma to school every morning, continued burning the pancakes on Saturdays, continued working quietly at his desk, reviewing structural reports that would never make headlines, even when they succeeded at their only real job, which was making sure nothing ever went wrong. He did receive, some months later, a distinguished honor from an aviation safety board, recognizing the incident from 11 years earlier as a defining case study in structural inspection integrity, an honor he accepted with the same understated grace he brought to everything else. He gave a short speech, no more than a few minutes long, in which he said almost nothing about himself, and almost everything about the anonymous inspectors and engineers who made air travel safe every single day without anyone ever learning their names. He said the real reward was never the plaque or the applause. It was every plane that landed exactly the way it was supposed to, carrying people home to the families waiting for them. Emma, for her part, wrote an essay for school that fall, one that her teacher would later ask permission to share more widely, an essay about heroes that never once mentioned capes or superpowers. She wrote that her hero did not wear a costume, that he wore a jacket with a frayed collar and carried a backpack with a broken zipper, that his only real superpower was refusing to look away from the truth, even when it was inconvenient, and that he had spent her whole life holding her hand and never once letting go, on airplanes and sidewalks, and every ordinary day in between. The essay found its way beyond her classroom, shared quietly among parents and teachers who found something in its plain, unguarded honesty that felt rare and worth passing along. It never made Michael famous in any lasting way, and he would not have wanted it to. What it did was remind a small circle of people, in a season when so much of the world seemed obsessed with performance and status, that the most important kind of strength rarely announces itself, that it shows up instead in small, steady choices made when no one else is paying attention. Michael kept a printed copy of the essay folded inside his wallet, worn soft at the creases from being taken out, and read more times than he would ever admit to anyone, even Emma. He never mentioned the video, never brought up Elise Hayes by name again in front of his daughter, and never once used the story to ask for anything, not a promotion, not a raise, not so much as a free upgrade the next time he flew. He continued to believe, as he always had, that the work itself was the reward, that a life spent quietly doing right by the people around him was worth infinitely more than a life spent chasing recognition for it. There were nights, still, when the house felt too quiet after Emma had gone to bed, when Michael sat alone at the wobbling kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, thinking about his wife and how much she would have loved watching their daughter grow into the sharp, curious, kind person she was becoming. On those nights he did not think about the flight, or the applause, or the headlines that had faded within a week. He thought only of Emma's small hand in his, the promise he had made himself the year she was born, to never let her feel, for even a single day, that she was anyone's burden. That promise, more than any award or any story that circulated briefly through the world and then disappeared, was the only legacy he had ever truly wanted to leave behind. Months later, father and daughter found themselves standing together at the edge of a regional air show, the kind of event Emma had begged to attend ever since her afternoon in the cockpit, watching aircraft climb into a pale autumn sky one after another, engines roaring, wings catching the light. Michael stood with his hands in his pockets, watching not the spectacle, but his daughter's face, lit up with the particular joy of a child who has found something she loves and does not yet know how far it might one day carry her. A man could wear an ordinary jacket and still carry something extraordinary inside him, something no designer label or corner office could ever manufacture or purchase. Money could buy privilege for a moment, could buy silence and deference and the illusion of importance, but it could never buy the quiet, lasting respect that comes only from character proven under pressure. What people remembered, in the end, was never the size of someone's bank account or the sharpness of their words in a moment of anger. What they remembered was the man who knelt beside his crying daughter and told her it would be okay, the man who refused to sign his name to a lie even when everyone around him wanted him to, the man who forgave without ever being asked to, and asked for nothing in return. Kindness, offered freely and without condition, has a way of outlasting cruelty long after the cruelty itself is forgotten. Arrogance may open doors for a season, may summon guards and threats, and the trembling deference of people too afraid to push back, but it rarely survives contact with the truth, and when it finally collapses, it tends to collapse all at once, in full view of everyone who once mistook it for strength. Somewhere over 35,000 feet, on an ordinary flight that nearly ended in humiliation, that truth had made itself impossible to ignore. And it had changed, in its own quiet way, everyone who witnessed it.